So you wanted to go first, Shan. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm crazy like that. Let's do this. You have my slideshow?
Absolutely. Let's bring you up here. And if anyone has comments, just please chime in.
She's put her glasses on now. It's going to get serious.
Oops, I got to remove.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second here.
It's going to get seriously easy to read.
Take this off. There we go. What's this? What is your... Come on. There we go.
There we are. Yeah, I'm type A, so I had to spend like 10 minutes this morning putting Roman numerals on all of my slides just in case. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to be kind of talking about a little bit the autonomy of the Medwa to controlled assassin to kept courtesan killers. And the courtesan aspect will be kind of more or less a setup for another episode that we do, so I can dive a lot deeper into it. But I want to start here with this slide and discuss a little bit the origins of the feminine healer. So before witches, the healer's lineage. Okay, so we're going to go back before the empire, before the courts, before the myths were written down, as far as we know. We're going to go back to visualize the hills, the valleys, the forests, the rivers, where the healer lived. And I'd like to invite you to imagine, if you can, what it might feel like to live in a world where your ability to track the stars and tend to the womb and speak to plants was considered sacred and sought after, actually, rather than suspicious. Enter our archetypal healer for this presentation, Medea, and she comes from that world. She's not Greek, but she's Gulchian, and that means that she comes from more or less like the edge of the unknown world, or the edge of the known world, where the old goddess traditions were still pulsing through the land. She's related to Helios, Circe, Hecate. So she's not just a woman who dabbled in magic. She was born into and raised by it. She is of it. So Medea is one of the oldest recorded sorceresses in Western tradition. It's likely that she was trained as a midwife, medicine priestess. Her myth will stretch back into, I think, around 8th century BCE, and rooted also in oral traditions that were even older than that. So by the time Euripides wrote Medea in 431 BCE, she had already been shaped by centuries of telling and retelling, and she's said to have lived in the age before the Trojan War, which places her mythically around 1200 BCE. Next slide, please. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this, but I want to say this up front. Any conversation about assassins, we're going to be talking about courtesans and seduction, women moving through spaces that others couldn't. And too often they're reduced to archetypes like poisoner, temptress, mistress, femme fatale. And we never really ask why this role exists across time and across cultures. So that's why I chose this thread to show it's not an exception. You know, when we look at these crazy stories, they seem super wild, but it's a pattern. And it seems to be, to me anyway, a response to restriction. So we can look at the next slide. Okay, so Medea not only has ties to medicines and healing rites, but also to female warrior bands, which were likely inspired by Scythian or Thracian traditions. Nomadic horsewomen who were feared and mythologized by the Greeks as Amazons. Medea, in some sources, she led or trained women who rode on horseback as warriors, untamed by marriage or city walls, wild ladies, dipped their arrows with poison, using sometimes serpent venom or toxic herbs, bodily fluids and waxes. They were required to maybe take 5 scalps before they could sleep with a man as an initiatory of blood rite, which tied sex, death, and power together. And Greek writers like Herodotus described Amazonian customs where women couldn't marry or engage in sex at all until they had killed an enemy in battle. Those two things could be tied together and one of them could be sensationalized, but this is what is available for sources, as far as I know. And some modern historians would speculate that a lot of these reflect more or less initiation rites.
Yeah, and just to add to that, just some of the cooler stuff that I've come across recently. Connected to Medea is also, of course, the myths of Hecate. And Hecate and Colchis goes really deep and connects deeply to a lot of the Amazonian stuff. In some of the earliest traditions, Hecate is Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who's supposed to be sacrificed to Artemis. And instead, she is transported to the temple at Toroi, where she becomes the head priestess and is said to have become Hecate. And where she then goes on to administer magic rites and do sacrifices against anyone who lands on their shores. And they say that they would sometimes bury them alive, they would sometimes toss them off cliffs. But most importantly for this story is that Hecate is said to have done all kinds of really intense magical rites upon these foreigners. And this is where she gains her magic, her medicine from. And then later on in the stories, if you go to Diodorus Siculus in his library, for example, they tell us that Medea rebels against her parents, Aeetes and Hecate. And she tries to take this magic and use it in salvation rites. And when she confronts Jason, it's because she's trying to warn Jason. Jason lands on the shore of Colchis. He's going to get killed by Hecate in these magic rites. And so she's there to save him. Little does she know that she's about to be cursed by Aphrodite, though.
It sounds like the tale of Prometheus, but like a Promethea, to quote Alan Moore.
Absolutely, but this is deep magic here. You're hitting onto one of the real secret traditions. Promethea, Alan Moore got that from the deep tradition that's in the Scholia, and it says that Medea is actually Promethea. That these are energies that keep reincarnating and cycling, and Zeus is actually Achilles, and that they're poles, and that they fall in love with each other constantly. And eventually they'll be reunited in the fields of Elysium, right? Even with the Iphigenia myths, for example. So Iphigenia gets sent off to Toroi, right? And Hecate and Medea, they're seen to be the same character, even though they're mother and daughter, but they're also the same. It gets really complicated in these traditions, right? Because we're dealing with something so far back. But part of the tradition is that Achilles is supposed to go marry her, but she's taken to Toroi. So they're ripped apart. They were supposed to meet at Troy, but it never happens. And so he actually at one point goes back to the islands of snakes where he was trained, and he even goes to the Cheronese, and he's screaming up and down the beach looking for Hecate, and he can't find her. And they said to have fallen in love in the dreams, and they get married in the dreams. And there's all this weird stuff too with Helen and that. It gets really wild. But all these kind of goddesses who are abducted are connected to this primordial goddess, this Persephone tradition, right? So when you're dealing with Hecate, Iphigenia, Persephone, they're all kind of one primordial character that's become diverged.
I find that in the majority of myths, although they might be linked to historical characters, they tend towards the archetypes, because that's how you're recording these things. It's as much a lesson in the archetypes as it is in the history. So these characters, if not immediately conforming to those archetypes, fall into that pattern pretty quickly because of human memory as much as anything, or the way the mind works.
Absolutely. Like there's clearly a euhemerist element, but it's also important to point out just how intense this tradition is of connecting these goddesses. Like John Tsitsi in his Lycophron, he connects Persephone with Hecate, with Artemis, Selene, with Medea and Rhea, and the earth, Demeter. And then we see the same thing also in Apuleius's Golden Ass. At the very end of the Golden Ass, the Great Mother reveals herself, and she says she is Isis, but Isis is all these other goddesses. And in the Greek, the primordial feminine who's abducted is Persephone, right? Spring.
So I do realize that Shan's doing a presentation, and we did warn Shan that we'd be like this. But I just want to bring up one last thing, Snappy, because you're so knowledgeable about these things. Semiramis.
Yes. Yeah. Semiramis is said to be another euhemerist element of Medea, right? And so it's hard to say if they're like, the Medea story probably greatly predates Semiramis, but Semiramis becomes equated into this. You see this, for example, in Lucian's The Syrian Goddess, where they're talking about this building of the mythical city, this feminine empress, again, right? When you're dealing with this idea of Medea, the Greeks believed that Medea was immortal and that she was here to be this savior energy to help people come to the end. She's the first and last, related to Hestia again, like I just said with all those other goddesses. And so there's this tradition of her constantly reincarnating. And so a lot of people equate the last story in Medea's life that Diodorus Siculus gives us is her becoming the leader of the Medes. After she gets kicked out of Athens, she's no longer allowed to be with her husband Aegeus. She gets pregnant by him and gives birth to a son named Metis. They then are forced to travel across like the desert, and she winds up bumping into the Aryans. And then she proves herself to the Aryans, and they make her their queen, and they change their name to the Medes. And the Medes become the people from which Semiramis is from. So
this is folk etymology, by the way, everybody.
Yes,
and
we're not talking about literal
presently accepted, but it is folk etymology. At least it's that important to them that they remembered it in this way.
Absolutely. But it's also important that we see that there's this idea of the feminine empress is really deep and ancient within the Greek tradition, and is clearly as something that's been scourged and like satirized. That'll get into Maurice's presentation, because like we have the Sphinx, which is clearly a feminine queen that's been monsterized and reduced. We have the Medusa, a temple priestess that's been monsterized and reduced. Right.
Well, I'm not surprised though, because the feminine is so notoriously hard to control. It's secretive. Absolutely. It's this assassination. You know what I mean? It's almost uncontrollable, save for violence, which isn't the way that you want to do things.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
This is stuff. Most relevant is in the cult of Hera, because in the earliest iterations of the cult of Hera, she's a goddess with a chariot. She's the leader of. You still see this in the later myths. Her role is to bring about order. She's the one who brings about order. But the Greeks interpret this of her being a horrible jerk. Her way of bringing order is to attack and to spur the heroes on, right? Anyone who shames her, she comes and causes huge issues for. But originally, she was an empowered goddess on her own. There was no Zeus. Zeus comes in far later, and she's, again, connected to these Amazonians. And this connects us to a far more ancient tradition. We even see this in the divination rites. So, like, one last point, and then I'll turn it back over to Medwa. Apollo steals the whole divination magic. In the earliest traditions, you have the Titan Phoebe. And it says that Phoebe falls in love with Apollo and gives her his name. And then she just disappears. She disappears from the entire tradition, right? Yeah. It's said that she doesn't get squashed. Like some of the Titans, like Hecate and Phoebe, they stick around, but, everyone else gets squashed by Zeus, right? And there's this ongoing patriarchy thing that happens, right? Even Artemis becomes less and less, and Apollo becomes more and more. You see the masculine over time take more of this role and the central authority. So we got to see all of this through that lens of satire and diminishing of feminine power, right? The great goddess in the Pelasgian tradition is called Despoina, which is where we get our word despot from. The great goddess in the Etruscan tradition is called Tyran, which is where we get the word tyrant from in Latin. So it's like this ancient mother goddess as this figure on the throne that's kind of this controlling ruler of order is real ancient. But take it away, Medwa. Sorry.
Perfect. I'm so glad that you brought up the part about Hecate, because it's like crucial to understanding this story, and it's a huge element. So thank you for that. And I welcome interjections. That's the magic of Occult Explorers.
Awesome.
We're fortunate to have such knowledgeable folks here. So we are going to move on then to the next slide. And all right, here we go. So we see traces of this world, talking about the Amazonians specifically, and archaeological finds like figurines of horse riding women, women holding infants and blades, women who were free, they were capable, and absolutely central to the spiritual life of their tribe. And this, like we were saying, is the kind of archetype which is repressed by patriarchal myth making, and it's turned into the mad woman trope or the femme fatale trope. But in truth, she is a guardian. She's a guardian of sacred rites. She is a teacher of deadly precision, and a protector of feminine sovereignty. Super important. We're talking about a time when at least 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. And a lot of these first medicines and magical practices were protecting the portal of the womb, protecting the health of the mother, and seeing that the babies are able to come through with the mother ideally. So women as midwives and the magic that comes with that. And so we can go to the next slide. We're talking about the sacred craft, Pharmaka. And so the word Pharmaka itself means either drug, potion. It really can depend on the context as well, because there is skill and intention applied here, but really like how different are drugs, medicine, potion, poison, you know what I mean? In antiquity, women or healers like Medea, they worked directly with the rhythm of the natural world. And we can say this and we can intellectualize it, but really think about what it means to work directly with the rhythm of the natural world. They didn't isolate chemicals in labs. They understood that timing, cosmos, placement, timing of harvesting of plants, animals, bodily fluids. It was an art form of absolute cosmic precision. So, you know, even in gardening, using these practices, a root that's pulled too early loses potency. A flower harvested past midday when there's too much sun burns out the oils and you lose oils. The sun, the moon, the season, they were all read like a calendar. Super important to the magic workings. We can go to the next slide. So Medea, she embodied this. She used her body, her voice, her breath, her blood, like all the other women who were just like her. Maybe not just like her, but like her. The pharmaca she prepared, they came to fruition kind of in specific moments with precise knowledge of the body and the world as co-creative forces, which is super important to think about. And her work, especially when we're thinking about women's bodies, because you guys are talking about the mystery of the feminine, and something that I find is helpful to think about when we're talking about stuff like this is men work on an annual cycle. So you experience all of your seasons throughout an annual cycle. Women, on the other hand, experience all of their seasons within a monthly cycle. So we are constantly cycling. We're constantly shifting and experiencing. And it can be very, very confusing for people who don't experience those cycles, and even for ourselves. So these are women who understood this, and they worked with it very, very intimately. And I think that some women actually, in a way, have a greater opportunity to work with magic in that way because we experience cycles so rapidly. So there's like a wider turnover of trial and error, or a faster turnover.
There's a deeper connection to the moon, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
To the elements.
Yeah. I think just experiencing the polarities of those energies during that quick cycle is what allows you to feel the difference quickly. Oh, this is different. Oh, I'm different now. Oh, it's different.
You know what it is too is that, like, I mean, it's different for every person, right? And you know, some women experience it less than others, but fundamentally, women are going through a physical change, which you can't not pay attention to. Whereas men can easily ignore their emotions or discredit them and say, "Oh, it has nothing to do with the changing of the energies of the universe," right? You can apply it to whatever else. You can't really win with women, and especially when women all start lining up with the cycles of the moon. You get a group of women together, and they all just come together. It's like, that's spooky.
I don't know. I'm not in those places at those times. I go very far away.
Yeah, you and a lot of other men in antiquity who wanted us to stay in huts because we were dirty during the menstruation.
Because you're angry.
Nice. There's so much power there, right?
Oh, bless it.
And you're right. You're right. So much is connected to the need to protect and say. I also want to bring up also the other side to the magic, which is you do have the midwifery, which is so important. We can't emphasize this enough, because how needed it would be to control hormones and cycles and protect from death during childbirth, just to stop bleeding and such. And, we see all of this hormonal magic on full display in the texts, right? Which would be needed to control, to help with birth and whatnot. But on top of that, the other thing that we see is the husbandry magic. And this is deeply connected with the feminine tradition as well. We see this on explicit display with the goddess Artemis. She's said to have been the one to domesticate the wolves. And this is why her priestesses are always called dogs and wolves, And it's very, very important. You see this with all of these different goddesses. The snakes are domesticated, which allow them to give them their venom. They have the domesticated birds. We talked about this in other episodes with Dion. The birds that give their milk, the dove milk. Like, so much of the magic is coming from husbandry, from working with animals. And this is a feminine art, taking the time to nurture and train rather than kill, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I chose this imagery as well, Snappy. I'm really glad that you bring this point up. Okay, so we're talking about precision, understanding of the cycles, and also using the body as a filtration system, literally a cauldron and a transmitter. So they would use plants grown and harvested at exact hours using some type of their own planetary clock. And also sometimes under certain phases of the moon, obviously, or on feast days, specific deities. Animal fats, venoms, secretions to preserve or activate substances, and the body of the animal was honored as part of the medicine. So not always killing. Seashells, like murex, not only for pigment, but also for ritual, and human body fluid, sweat, menstrual blood, saliva, breast milk. They were seen as powerful carriers of life force. Again, like a filtration system that could be used in rituals to bind intention into physical form. So if we think for a moment, when we're talking about something like a medicine that would have 50, 60, 70 ingredients, and you have to understand their temperatures, their relationship with the cosmos, when to harvest, the spirit of whatever it is you're working with, and their interactions with each other, how long would it take you to learn the way of creating this into efficacy?
Right.
So generations is the answer.
Yeah.
Like generations and generations. Yeah.
Many. Yeah. So we're at the next slide, which we are going to talk a bit about theriac, because I find it hard not to mention this. An ancient complex medicinal compound used kind of as a panacea and an antidote to poison. So its codified form appears in Roman texts. The theriac has its roots in Greek pharmacology and evolved across many cultures over centuries. But I hypothesize, and I wonder if you guys agree, that the theriac, at least in its foundational form, was originally formulated by women. And this is, it's right.
It almost certainly
is. It's a female art. The whole thing's a female art. I mean, at the very least, it might be like the fashion industry, which is all gay men. It might be something like that. But these are very feminine. I mean, you can't prove any of this because it's not written down.
Exactly.
But, these are feminine arts. It's more like, I think, as a broad stroke, men look at macro things and women tend to look at micro things. That's true in life now, in conversation. But yeah, I think they would have been the studied, more scientific type at the time.
We see it full on display within the texts. Because when we go to the text, from a first surface level, you would see that Asclepius is the god of medicine, and you would think that most of this comes from Asclepius. But Asclepius tells us he's building off of the Median tradition. And all of this is coming from a far earlier class of works. And they're all honoring these great goddesses, Hecate and Medea, as the ones who bring the medicine. And it's deeply related to this idea of the Holy Grail. You can't talk about the Theriac, you can't show a cup with a snake without talking about the kolpos, the pouch, right? What is the
dark
pouch?
harbor,
the bosom, the dark harbor? You're talking about the feminine creative power, her ability to give birth. And so much of this is related to a lot of the Dionysian Maenad rites. But again, it's hard to understand when we're dealing with this stuff. We're dealing with levels and years of satire, years and years of character assassination, and none of these women wrote anything down, right? So there's clearly a sexual element and a magical element on display, and there's clearly some provocative intensity going on, and it has to do with birthing rites. Now, in the earliest texts, they're talking about consuming abortions, ripping apart abortions, and using the blood of the child for these transformations. They're talking about changing children into pharmacological drug machines in some of these texts, So it gets really wild when we start to get into the earliest stuff with the Theriac magic. And again, where does the satire end and the reality begin? It's hard to say. We only have these sources of which they're obscured, and they're designed to attack the women.
Yeah.
But it is there in the symbols, definitely. It's particularly as Shan put it, they're using the body as a filtration system, aka a dispensary.
We see this also on full display with the Dionysian tradition and how it evolves into the Christian context and continues on in the occult sphere as well, right? This consuming when you look at the Dionysian rites, the Hierophant used to do this magic spell where he would transform the water into wine, and he would add a secret element that no one knew what he was doing. And then they would use this and they'd say they're drinking the blood and eating the body of Dionysus, right? This is part of that whole thing of going through the death and rebirth cycles. But even this relates to far earlier magic. These Dionysian rites are coming out of the Demeter tradition, right? Again, taking us back to Persephone and Medea again. And it's just been so obscured over time. But we see the same consumption in the Catholic Church, and we see a lot of accusations, right? Crowley famously
early Gnostics,
right? And the Gnostics,
early Gnostics has been written,
right. The Gnostics are engaged in spermatophagy, right? They're eating and consuming of these human bodily fluids for the purposes of transcendental magic, And now you got to imagine if the Hierophant is also doing something like mushrooms, which are your favorite, Ryan, then that their body is going to be transmitting this magic to anyone who's consuming them, consuming their whatever, And this is a deep occultist stuff that stays within the tradition.
It's there. You can't, it might be on the fringes, but it is there, and it might have been distorted through time, but it is there. I mean, if you want to talk about the young person as a dispensary, go and look into the sign of Aquarius, see how far back that goes. That even goes to Sumeria, but that's not the topic of this episode. And I do remember that Shan was doing a presentation, but we had to talk about drugs and vaginas.
Yeah, you see that also, a perfect example of the spell. If people want to see it, go read the PGM. How to create a dream oracle. Get yourself a little boy or girl. Freaking creepy as hell, man.
I mean, just go and read the PGM anyway. It's fascinating.
But just for fun. I think at one point all medicine was literally transcendental medicine, though, just as an aside. So I really want to...
What do you mean by that, Shanna? I don't understand. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? Are you being serious? Is this a serious question?
Well, for us and for them, yeah.
Okay, cool. So how do I say this? More or less, I think that You really have to get into the mindset of what it was like to live at a time where you literally were operating as a piece of the cosmos rather than an observer of it, and what it would mean to experience that, and also to be actively working with the earth so intimately and harvesting plants and making medicines. I think that we literally were just transcendental constantly out of in this other space that kept us connected into these energies. That's like the most simplified way that I could explain this without going too deep.
This is basically what philosophers like Nietzsche and Klages say, right? Part of the big problem with our modern conception is that we're built upon all of the weight of experience, dead metaphor, and culture, and we're no longer intimately connected to a natural perception of reality because we're building upon all of these other ideas that have been imprinted upon us through all of this weight of culture. Whereas these ancients, they're more connected to the natural elemental reality. So there's definitely that aspect. And as we see with Medea, her earliest references are as the soteria, the savior, the one that connects you to the cycles. I think also when life is so violent and so short and everyone's dying on a whim or going through such incredible pain, the need to be able to see this moment as not the end, as one that will lead to the future is so profound. And we see this so much in the way that the ancients are said to have behaved, at least in the mythic texts, right? The people of the Golden Age, they don't care about their life. They recognize that when they die, they will be born again, and they're willing to die for cause. And they're empowered by simplicity, right? There's all this thing too. The ancients, they're satisfied with spelt. They're satisfied with water. They're not bound by greed. There's this whole idea that they're connected to the earth and they're empowered by intention, you know?
Do you not think that might be wishful thinking in place by more modern scholars, though? I hear a lot of this stuff like, sorry, go on.
Oh, I do think some of that is a modern conception, but I ultimately see
I'm not saying it is.
I ultimately see some of it is very, 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 very true. As soon as you start to like, for example, you look at children. Children don't have to deal with the insanity of religion until parents poison them with it, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have to deal with the insanity of politics until we're poisoned, or nationalism, all of these ideas, all of this metaphor. And so much of our understanding is based on dead metaphor. So unless people are doing the empowered reading and really engaging with culture, they don't fully understand anything. They're disconnected from the reality. Yeah. They're in this self-referential loop of bullshit. You know?
Yeah. And you can see these people wandering around. We have many names for the different varieties of them, but you do see these people that are basically walking around in the subconscious, which without the weight of culture on you or too much information might be very freeing. But also you must recognize that you are, as Shan put it, being worked on by those cosmological implications. And that you got to be careful of that. And don't forget, these people were living within a certain cosmological system that they believed that wasn't true, but they did believe it. Or it's not as true as they thought it was. Let's put it like that.
I also think it's important that we understand that like life is an ongoing generative evolutionary process.
I was going to say,
we're not meant to return to the Golden Age, right? We can idealize the Golden Age and we can look at it as a beautiful thing, but we have to understand that cannot return, not in the way it was, not without us profoundly healing the natural world in which we find ourselves. If we wish to return to a golden age, the closest thing we can get to is a rhyme. And the only way we get there is through profound transformation. We have to heal the earth. We'd have to think about what it would be like, the golden age and the implications, right? I believe so much about our culture is based upon the cultivation of the earth. And we can't have a culture like theirs because we exist in a totally different reality, one that's built upon all this technology. We can't, there's no not knowing the culture, right? The culture disconnects us, but it also unites us and empowers us in understanding. Where we find ourselves, we have to deal with the weight of it. We can't be in that imaginal state.
We need to get back on the Theriac. That's what we need to do.
We do. We need to get back on the Theriac.
Yeah.
Also, as an aside, this is a perfect place to mention, which does relate to my presentation, Rupert Sheldrake's hypothesis of morphic resonance, because all of this exists in us today. And it's also a perfect example of why we can never return 100% to the golden age, because we are constantly receiving and absorbing information in our DNA that we carry with us throughout all time. So you can access anything from all time through where you are now, right? And it's the idea that there are patterns in nature and they don't just disappear when a group dies. Those patterns remain. So anyways, that's an aside. And it's something I thought about while creating this presentation is the morphic resonance of the Medwa, the morphic resonance of this deep culture of medicine and how it affects today's women. So if you go to the next slide, then I'm just showing basically an ingredient list. Feel free to peruse it. And I just wanted to mention that even though the Theriac may have been created by warrior healers or priestesses, as hypothesized and suggested, the first official written formula is attributed to Andromachus the Elder in the 1st century CE, who served as the personal physician to Emperor Nero. His version, the Theriac of Andromachus, was so significant, he composed it in Greek hexameter verse to preserve its integrity. Later, Galen would refine it into a version used for over a millennium. But we must ask, whose knowledge did Andromachus inherit? Who first knew how to combine over 60 ingredients into a medicine that addressed poison, disease, fatigue, digestion, fertility, and even spiritual protection? So we can go to the next slide.
I just want to do a cool aside here because
Please.
You brought up Nero, and Nero, you got to understand how deep he was in the ancient black magic. He was doing some of the most intense, wild shit imaginable.
His lineage.
There's this story about him doing what they call vampire magic. Okay, this is the kind of words that they use. This is the translation that I'm reading from the Greek. I'm not sure what the original Greek is, but this is what they're calling it, vampire magic. And they would say that Nero used to dress up as a plebe, and he would go out in the middle of the night and assault strangers and beat them to death with his hands. And if they fought back and he would start to lose, then the Praetorian Guard would come out and protect him. But he would do this every night, go kill a random person, strangle them to death. And he said that this was empowering him in spirit. Like crazy, crazy dark magic. And again, he's relating this to the Hecatic tradition and all this stuff. Yeah. So there's wild stuff going on.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about Nero.
Sorry, that reminds me of blooming modern streamers that go around bullying people, and then when they get turned on, they got a big fella behind them ready to protect you. It's psychotic.
Absolutely psychotic, right? Absolutely.
He was a great performer. Nero's entire rule was performance. Like it was notorious that it was like theater, his whole thing.
Oh, and that's so important that you bring it up, because the only way that this kind of black magic is fully understood is within the Greco-Roman tradition. What is the greatest virtue of the ancient Greek world? Hospitality and respect to the stranger. What is the greatest thing that you could possibly do? Go murder a stranger for no bloody reason. Just go kill someone. This is the act of killing a god.
Yeah.
The ultimate taboo, a breaking of a sin, right?
Do you think that's with the Dionysian madness, the women going out tying up the babies and stuff like that? Do you think that's similar?
That absolutely is similar. All of the left-hand magic is always about rejecting a taboo. Anytime there's an extreme taboo, the Dionysian is going to break it down. And so whatever is the most taboo of a society will be exposed. This is what also people have trouble with, because black magic changes over time, because what's taboo changes over time. But you can really understand a culture by looking at its black magic. You know, and this in the Roman times would have been the ultimate taboo, right? Just like when we're talking about later on in our modern times, why people get so freaked out about a lot of these ancient magic when they talk about children and the sacrifice of children and stuff. You know, that is something that we can't handle in our modern conceptions. So a lot of this black magic now has to deal with this kind of stuff, or committing a murder, the cutting off of the heads, the ripping apart of babies. You see all of this stuff again and again and again, but ultimately you have to be pushed to the brink where your ego is shattered and you learn to experience the all. because all law is a lie, right? All law is a manufacturing of humanity. It's not on the universe. The only universal law is adaptation.
So have you derived that from the ultimately in all arenas, the breaking of that taboo results in a charge of the person that did the breaking of the taboo? Is it like a charge that you get? You know, like a near ecstasis, like the orgasmic.
It is a bliss. It is an ecstasis, because we got to remember, it's always about polar magic in this tradition. When you go to one extreme, you find the other. You find the other. So by ripping apart or being ripped, look at Orpheus. Orpheus is ripped apart and becomes a god. Hercules is set afire on a pyre and becomes a god. Astraea sets herself on fire and becomes a god, right? You have to die and be destroyed. You got to break that ultimate taboo of death to finally gain your highest transcendence. You see this so much in so many different ways. You can look at it on the other side, right? It's always the highest good leads to the ultimate, the ultimate. You always have to see the polar magic. Like, for example, why is the donkey so sacred? Because the donkey is the last. It's the last of the last, right? They're the beast of burden and they're the horniest animal. So in the Greek mind, they were considered the absolute worst. And in the stories, they bear the statue of the Great Mother on their back. They have to bear the toil. And then when they die, what happens to the donkey? They're skinned and turned into the drum. They're beaten. This is one of the great secrets they tell us, because then the donkey becomes the literal heartbeat of the Great Mother. That which is last is now first. You get to the Great Mother through the donkey. This is the myth that is on display in the golden ass. You have to be the lowest of the low before you can get to the top. And this is the same thing within these Median rites. The magic of salvation comes from murdering the foreigner.
Yeah.
Right? And breaking the taboo.
Between those masculine and feminine archetypes, where you get hierarchy in the masculine and kind of the lowest common denominator, a broad sweep in that feminine. So the lowest would be absolutely applicable for that. That's great. Love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right.
Well, I'd like to tell you guys a little story about Nero and his lineage a bit.
Let's hear it.
So let's continue the thread. You can see here Agrippina the Younger with Nero, and an illustration that I like to think represents Locusta. So from Andromachus, we arrive at Nero, and where there is Nero, there is his mother, Agrippina the Younger. And through her, we encounter Locusta of Gaul, who was a poisoner. But she wasn't just a poisoner. She was a woman in her own Celtic medicinal lineage. She was likely trained in herbalism, venoms, ritual plant work that stretched far beyond the Roman imagination. And her reputation was so renowned that it caught the attention of Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, sister to Emperor Caligula, which might give you a clue to how effed up their lineage was. And it's absolutely fascinating. So please do some research on it. It was Agrippina the Younger who called upon Locusta's expertise to help secure her son Nero's ascent to power. Locusta's poisons were instrumental in the deaths of Emperor Claudius, which was husband to Agrippina the Younger, and anyone else basically who stood in Nero's way. There's a reason I like to think that all of this took shape, but we could talk about it another time. As for Agrippina, her story itself is just like shadowed with survival and strategy. There's so much ambition and trauma in her lineage. I don't know if she's a villain or a victim, really, but she understood.
A bit of both, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. But she definitely understood the value of a woman who knew her plants. So we've got the next slide here. Yep, you're there. Locusta's first known act under Roman record came at the request of Agrippina the Younger, who wanted to ensure her son Nero's ascension to the throne, and the target was her husband at the time, Emperor Claudius. So according to sources, Emperor Claudius was poisoned during a banquet in 54 CE by his favorite, oh, Ryan, you're going to love this, his favorite mushroom dish. However, It contained poisonous death cap mushrooms, which are a species, to be fair, that could be mistaken for edible varieties, but they should have been well known to trained herbalists. So some accounts say that the fatal dish was prepared by Agrippina herself. Other people suggest Locusta, who was already notorious for her knowledge of toxic plants, and that she herself crafted the poison. So in an attempt to purge the poison, his attendants followed the standard remedy, which was reaching for a feather that was intended to induce vomiting. But even the feather had been sabotaged. So it could have been coated by Locusta or Agrippina or Nero, but coated with a secondary poison that then double poisoned when they tried to gag him to purge the initial mushroom poison.
Genius. I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, don't do that to people. Don't use feathers anymore. You'd have to use something else.
Dion wasn't here to say it, but trigger warning, trigger warning. We're going to talk about sexuality. We're going to talk about murder. We're going to talk about poisons. We're going to talk about weird stuff. So we're doing it, and it's going to get weirder. So after Claudius died from this, Nero became emperor at 16 years old. So Agrippina at his side, Locusta soon to be summoned again, and you can go to the next slide. Here's another story of Nero's household in early 55 CE. The first poison Locusta prepared for Nero's half-brother Britannicus was too mild. It acted as a purgative rather than murdering him, basically. And Nero was furious because he had asked Locusta to poison his half-brother Britannicus because Britannicus is standing in the way of him coming to throne and remaining in power, basically. So Nero was furious, and in a display of rage and control, he personally flogged Locusta with his own hand. The image is there for drama, berating her incompetence and demanding a more effective dose. So Locusta prepared a new, faster-acting concoction. She tested it on a goat, which lingered for a few hours, and then on a pig, which died instantly. So then she took the poison to a formal imperial banquet where Britannicus, who was the teenage son of Claudius and the legitimate heir, was offered a warm drink, as was customary. Following palace protocol, the drink was first tasted by a food taster in the presence of others to prevent suspicion. But Britannicus, as many in the court well knew, preferred his drinks cold. That preference was no secret. It was habitual and predictable. So when he requested the drink to be cooled, cold water was brought to the table and added to his cup. And in that cold water, according to Tacitus, the poison had been dissolved and the effect was immediate. It keeps going. Britannicus collapsed in front of Rome's elite. Nero responded instantly, insisting, "It's just an epileptic seizure. He gets these. He's had them forever," which was a condition that he had suffered since childhood, Britannicus had. And most people accepted it. The body was removed and dinner resumed. But Britannicus never recovered. He died the same night, and just one day before his 14th birthday, which was the age at which he was to officially enter manhood and claim his status. Only 4 months had passed since his father Claudius died, also by suspected poisoning. Locusta, who was behind the poison, was rewarded handsomely by Nero. She received landed estates, local pardon for any past crimes or future crimes, and a cohort of pupils to train in her lethal craft. Yes, she had her own school for poisoning. She became Rome's official poisoner and was backed by imperial power. Next slide, please.
The official poisoner.
Official. So Nero's reign was crazy. The very next day, Nero held Britannicus's funeral, and it started raining. And the ceremony was very, very hastily arranged, and they were like, we're just going to go through this anyways. There was no eulogy, there was no grand procession. And when questioned about the lack of honor, Nero explained that it was a tradition in the case of untimely deaths not to oppress the public with eulogies and processions. But the true spectacle was not in what Nero said. It was in what everybody saw. So Cassius Dio records that Nero had the boy's corpse covered in white gypsum, It's like a chalky plaster. You can see in the illustration something that might look like that, used to conceal the telltale signs of certain poisonings. And there was a certain discoloration that would happen to the skin with very specific poisons, and it was kind of common knowledge. So if people would see that the skin was this color, they would suspect poisoning. So they covered him with this white gypsum. And as the funeral procession moved through the forum, the rain intensified. The gypsum began to melt away, streaking and sliding off of his face and body until what beneath was exposed as the darkened skin, the ashen patches, the livid marks that were visible to everyone who passed the body. Whispers erupted. Yep. The excuse of seizure was hollow now. Everybody was onto it. In 68 CE, just 14 years after poisoning her way into history, Locusta was executed. Not for her crimes, but for her association with Nero, basically. Nero was her protector, and he had finally fallen. After years of instability, public unrest, and political betrayal, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He was deserted by his guards. He was hunted by his enemies. Nero fled Rome. And then, basically, he was arrested and executed. But he actually took his own life. He was facing arrest and execution, but he took his own life. Reportedly with the help of a servant. And I'm not exactly 100% on what that servant did for him. So with this chaos happening, Galba, the next emperor, sought to cleanse Rome of Nero's excesses because it was madness. And with that, Locusta was condemned as a symbol of imperial corruption, and her execution was very swift without public trial. You can go to the next slide here. So what happens when we no longer permit women to be seen as powerful? A courtesan, someone that you may hear mentioned today, is a woman trained to move fluently through elite social, political, and private spheres. She uses conversation, appearance, emotional regulation, and sexuality as tools of influence. The courtesan was educated. Very well educated, often multilingual, skilled in arts, diplomacy, human behavior. She was expected to entertain, to charm, to soothe, and in many cases, to shape the minds and decisions of powerful men. Next slide, please. So what is a courtesan if not a healer, right? If you really think about it, they're a soother of the busiest minds in the room, if not the world. They restore men's clarity. They temper his moods. They listen when others are silent, and they speak when no one else can. She's incredibly therapeutic to important figures. She regulates the nervous system of the empire through presence, timing, and precision just by being there. Next slide, please.
Oh, can I ask a question on that last slide? Who's the artist there? I don't think I've ever seen better painted hands in my life.
I know, right? Wow, Ryan, I'm so glad you noticed. I just really wanted to have something intimate, you know? I'll send it to you. I'll send you the artist.
Cool.
It's amazing. Okay, so here we are. So I don't want us to mistake a courtesan for being soft because they have healing qualities. They've also been some of the most effective assassins in history across all cultures because they can mold the spark of Eros into weaponry. They're trusted. They're allowed into these spaces. They're expected to disarm and not expected to kill, but they do disarm. And that's kind of the point, right? Like it's unsuspecting, that seduction.
Oh, there's that thing of men's IQ drop in the presence of a beautiful woman. It's just a fact of life. I've seen it happen to my friends many times. You don't notice when it happens to you because your IQ goes down and you're not able to recognize it. Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, women are extremely disarming for men, extremely.
Yeah, so imagine if it's someone who's like crazy well educated and also an amazing dancer and knows how to use inflections of voice, certain placement of words, just a touch of a hand in a very specific way. Like all of those on top of what most guys are already like duh over. It's like you can't resist the courtesan. She can enter a room that no one else is allowed into. She can get close enough to whisper or to strike if need be, and she can leave with nothing but a rumor if she has to. She can do devastating damage. She can access men in ways that there's no guard, there's no advisor, even their own wives could ever access them in this way. And when their defenses are down, their bodies are open, and their minds are more malleable for her whispers and inputs. And in that moment...
failing all that, they just get one boob out there.
That's it.
And that's it. It's over. It's just all done.
You can see it's over.
Tell me what to do.
Yeah. And then next slide, and I'll wrap up so we can get on to the next presentation.
I just wanted to add one little point here. Courtesans for sure, but we also can't discount the eunuchs and the young boys that would be in many of these courts, especially like in the Islamic courts, and in the Byzantine courts. There were eunuchs everywhere, and they would be very much fulfilling a feminine role, acting as courtesans in the same way that Shan described. So it wasn't just a single feminine gender thing, but rather a role that was played, this emotional support role, which would often then be weaponized.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so my closing statement here is just, what is a courtesan if not the final adaptation of a woman who was once a priestess, a healer, a warrior, and a midwife? She is, in a way, she's what remains when the world says no to sacred power and yes to seductive compliance and weaponizes it. She survives by becoming what the world will allow, while still carrying the morphic resonance of the intelligence, the influence, and the precision of everything that came in before. So even if you try to erase the Medwa, you don't erase her power, you just change the form that it takes. And that is the end.
Beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. Really love it.